She had made herself look smaller than she was. That was the first thing she did. Before she knocked on the servants' door of Ashvale Park, Leonora Stowe had spent the better part of the night at the coaching inn in Millhaven, considering how a woman of her exact height and coloring and bearing managed to walk into a house and not be recognized for what she was. The answer, she had concluded somewhere around 2 in the morning with the candle burning low, was that people only saw what they expected to see. She had arrived at Millhaven with one trunk and a letter of reference she had written herself, carefully, in a hand that was not her own. She had sold her second trunk and the silver-handled brush set in York to pay for the coaching fare. She had left behind the pearl earrings her mother had given her and taken only the small garnet pin that could pass for the sort of thing a respectable woman of modest means might own. She had dressed her hair plainly. She had left off the petticoat that gave her skirts their proper shape. She had looked at herself in the glass before she left the inn and thought, "Yes, that will do." The housekeeper who answered the servant's door was a tall woman named Mrs. Greer, with eyes the color of pewter and a manner that suggested she had been managing this particular house since before the current Earl had thought to inherit it. She looked Leonora over once, the way a woman who has hired and dismissed a great many people looks over a new arrival. Quickly, but missing nothing. "Miss Stowe," she said, not as a question. "Yes, ma'am, you're later than expected. The coach from York was delayed at Harwick. The road was poor." Mrs. Greer considered this and seemed to decide it was plausible enough. She stepped aside and let Leonora into a stone corridor that smelled of wood smoke and lye soap, and led her through the back passages of a house that Leonora had not entered through the back passages of since she was 11 years old and trying to steal biscuits from the kitchen. She did not let herself look at things the way she wanted to look at them. That was the second thing she had decided, at the coaching inn. She would not slow her stare. She would not slow her step in the places where she wanted to slow it. She would not look up at the ceiling in the main corridor. She had learned that ceiling on her back as a child, lying on the turkey carpet and counting the plasterwork. Because the new staff did not look at ceilings. She would not look at the painting of her grandmother at the top of the east stair. She would keep her eyes at the appropriate level, which was to say, slightly downward, attentive and unremarkable. She had perhaps 3 weeks. That was what her mother's solicitor had told her, that the matter of the estate would take at minimum 3 weeks to reach a resolution, that the documents her uncle had filed were irregular, but not immediately voidable, that she was to sit tight and wait. She had sat tight for 4 months. She was not sitting tight any longer. Mrs. Greer showed her to a small room at the end of the north corridor, on the upper floor. It had a single window that looked over the kitchen garden. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall. It was not, Leonora thought, entirely unlike the kind of room one read about in improving novels, the sort where the deserving heroine learns humility. "Duties begin at 6, Mrs. Greer said, already turning. "You will assist with the upstairs rooms. His lordship is particular about his study. You will not touch it. The silver needs doing every Thursday. Cook will tell you what else." She was almost out of the door when Leonora asked, quietly, "And the family?" Mrs. Greer paused. "His lordship is in residence. Lady Strathmore is expected Friday for the fortnight." She said the second name with a particular kind of flatness that communicated quite a lot. "You will make yourself useful and invisible. That is all that is required." She left. The door closed. Leonora sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the window and the kitchen garden below, and the corner of the north wall where the old pear tree was, the one she had climbed every summer of her childhood until she was 14 and too old, and kept doing it anyway when no one was watching. The pear tree was still there. She put her hands in her lap and pressed them together until they steadied. She met the Earl the next morning. She had been in the upstairs corridor with a cloth and a tin of beeswax, attending to the wainscoting when he came out of the study. She had been expecting him. She had heard the voice the evening before through the door she was not supposed to be standing near. Low, deliberate, the kind of voice that carried without effort. And she had built herself a picture of him. Cousin Harriet had described him in her last letter as perfectly presentable but somewhat cold. The solicitor had called him efficient. Uncle Mortimer, who had engineered this entire arrangement, had referred to him simply as the Earl, as though the title were a fact of nature rather than a thing Mortimer himself had been instrumental in arranging. What she had not expected was that he would come out of the study holding a pair of riding boots and holding them out to her before he had looked at her properly. "These need doing before 11, he said. "The boot boy is ill." She looked at the boots. They were caked with dried mud from the heels to above the ankle. He had clearly ridden in real country, not the groomed park paths, but out through the fields where the ground was still soft from last week's rain. She took the boots. He had already turned back toward the study when she said, and she was not entirely sure why she said it, except that she had always had, as her mother put it, a difficulty with silence that was unjust. "The boot boy's name is Peter, my lord. He has had a fever since Tuesday." He stopped. He turned. This time he actually looked at her. The Earl of Ashvale, Dominic Harcourt, the fourth Earl, 32 years old according to Cousin Harriet, who was thorough, was not what Leonora would have called cold. He was, she thought, something more particular than that. He was the kind of man whose face did not move much, but whose attention, when it settled on you, settled completely. He was looking at her now the way a man looks at something that has said something unexpected. "You know the boot boy's name," he said. "I asked," she said. "He looked poorly when I arrived." He stood there for a moment. She kept her expression correctly blank, helpful, unremarkable, a little deferential. She had been practicing this expression in the small glass over the washstand. "See that cook send something up to him," the Earl said at last, and went back into the study. She stood in the corridor with the muddy boots in her hands and thought, carefully, about nothing at all. Lady Vivian Strathmore arrived on Friday as promised, with 2 carriages, a lady's maid, a quantity of luggage that seemed designed to communicate something, and a manner that reminded Leonora of nothing so much as a very well-dressed cat assessing new territory. She was 28, beautiful in the architectural way that required considerable maintenance, and she had been corresponding with the Dowager Countess. The Earl's mother, who wintered in Bath and was apparently enthusiastic about the match for the better part of the season. Leonora knew this because the Dowager Countess's letters were delivered on Tuesdays, and she was the one assigned to carry them to the Earl's study, and the Earl left them unopened on the corner of his desk for 3 days before reading them, which told its own story. In private, which was to say, when she thought no one who mattered was listening. Lady Strathmore was precise in her cruelties. It was a practiced thing, like playing an instrument. She had a way of looking at the staff that made it clear. She was calculating their exact worth and finding it negligible. She called for things to be done and then found fault with how they had been done, but always with a smile that made it impossible to object to without seeming unreasonable. She referred to Leonora as the new girl, even after Mrs. Greer had corrected her twice. On the 3rd day of her visit, she returned from an afternoon drive and decided the sitting room arrangement was wrong and that it needed to be changed entirely. By Leonora. "Now," Lady Strathmore said pleasantly, "if you would just move that cabinet there. No, not there. There. Yes, and the chair must go by the window, obviously." She stood in the center of the room, directing, as Leonora moved furniture in her work dress, and thought about the fact that this specific room, with the yellow silk walls that her mother had chosen in 1847 and the fireplace that had a slight drawing problem that her father had meant to have fixed and never did, was her sitting room, or had been, or should have been. She moved the chair to the window. "It still isn't right," Lady Strathmore said, looking at the room with her head slightly tilted. "Perhaps the light is better near the east window in the morning," Leonora said neutrally, "and the west window in the afternoon. It depends when you prefer to use the room." Lady Strathmore looked at her with the particular expression she used for people who had overstepped. "I didn't ask for your opinion," she said. "No, my lady," Leonora said. She looked correctly at the carpet. When Lady Strathmore swept out of the room 20 minutes later, satisfied with an arrangement that was nearly identical to the original one, Leonora put her hand briefly on the mantelpiece, the cold white marble of it, which she had touched 10,000 times, and allowed herself one moment. Just one. Then she straightened and went back to work. She had not come here only to endure it. She had come because Mr. Ashby, the solicitor, the younger partner at Graves and Ashby, who had been handling her mother's affairs and who she trusted implicitly and without, she admitted to herself, entirely sound reason, had told her that the documents in the Ashvale study might contain something useful. Her Uncle Mortimer had been the estate's trustee after her father died, and he had managed the trusteeship in a manner that Mr. Ashby described as irregular, and Leonora privately described as theft. The question was whether there was paper evidence of the irregularity somewhere in the house, the kind that a court might find persuasive. She could not hire a solicitor to search the house. She had not the money, and in any case, no solicitor would be admitted. She could not ask Mrs. Greer, who was loyal to the current Earl and the current arrangement, and had no reason to be otherwise. She could not write to Cousin Harriet, whose correspondence she suspected was occasionally read by Cousin Harriet's husband, who was friendly with Mortimer. She could, however, be hired as a housemaid and find herself, in the course of duties, in proximity to the Earl's study. Whether any of this would do her any good she did not know. But she had sat in the solicitor's office in York and listened to him explain what could be done through official channels and how long it would take. And she had thought, by the time that is finished, there will be nothing left to recover. The house will have been sold properly and the money dispersed, and all of it legal and final. So she had made herself smaller than she was and come here instead. The difficulty, she was discovering, was the Earl himself. He was not what she had expected. She had expected, based on Mortimer's involvement, based on the way the estate had been arranged, based on simple logic, a man who either knew what had been done or did not want to know. She had expected someone who had taken possession of a thing and was disinclined to look too closely at how he had come to possess it. But the Earl of Ashvale went over the estate accounts on Thursday evenings, alone, for 3 hours, and emerged from the study with the particular expression of a man who has found something that does not add up. She had seen this because she was in the corridor on Thursday evenings. She had made it her business to be in the corridor on Thursday evenings. He spoke to the tenants by name. He had sent for a doctor for the tenant at Northfields without being asked, and had paid the bill from his own account, which Mrs. Greer mentioned in passing and apparently found unremarkable. He had told Lady Strathmore, quietly but unmistakably, that the matter of the house redecoration could wait until spring when she brought it up at dinner, and Lady Strathmore had subsided in a way that suggested she was unaccustomed to being told to wait. None of this meant he was innocent of the larger arrangement, but it made her less certain than she had been. She found what she was looking for on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her time at Ashvale. She was carrying a coal scuttle to the upstairs landing, a task she had volunteered for specifically because it brought her past the small anteroom off the study. when she noticed that the study door had been left ajar and there was no one inside. The Earl had ridden out at 9. It was now 10:30. She set the coal scuttle down, quietly. She did not go into the study. She had decided, at the coaching inn, that she would not take anything and she would not disturb anything. She had a list of what she was looking for. The original deed of arrangement that Mortimer had filed in 1858, and any correspondence between Mortimer and the then solicitor for the estate, a man named Cratchley, who had since retired and whose retirement Leonora had always found suspiciously well-funded. She stood in the doorway of the anteroom, which had a clear sight line to the left-hand shelves of the study, and she read the spine labels from where she stood. The ledgers were organized by year and type. The correspondence files were to the right, and on the third shelf from the bottom, in a box that was labeled with her father's name, in faded ink, which she had not expected to see, which she had not prepared herself to see, was what she was looking for. She memorized the shelf position. She memorized the label. She left the anteroom and picked up the coal scuttle and went down the corridor. And it was not until she reached the landing that she allowed herself to put the scuttle down and lean against the wall and do what she had been determined for 3 weeks not to do, which was press the back of her hand against her mouth and stand there for a moment with her eyes closed. Her father's name, in faded ink. She straightened after a minute. She picked up the scuttle. She went on. She wrote to Mr. Ashby that evening and sent the letter through the postal runner before anyone in the house was likely to notice she had sent a letter. She told him what shelf, what box, and what was likely inside. She asked him to come to Millhaven and arrange what could be arranged from the outside. She told him she thought they had perhaps 2 weeks before Lady Strathmore's visit concluded, and the house reverted to its quieter state, which would make things considerably more complicated. She did not tell him about the Earl. She was not sure what she would have said. The morning everything changed. She was in the library, not cleaning the library. She had finished that an hour ago, but standing at the west window that looked over the south lawn and the old stone wall at the edge of the property, the wall where she had sat with her father on summer evenings and watched the light go. She had given herself 5 minutes. She had checked that no one was in the corridor. She had stood there and let herself look at it, the lawn, the wall, the long evening light that fell across the grounds of a house that had been in her family for 4 generations. Miss Stowe. She turned. The Earl was in the doorway. She had no expression she could arrange quickly enough. She was aware of this. She saw him take in her face, whatever was in it, and something shift in his own. "I was just finishing," she said. "I'm sorry, my lord. How long have you been standing there?" "A few minutes." He came into the library. He stood beside her, close enough that she could see he was looking at the same view she had been looking at, the lawn and the wall, and the light. "It is a good view," he said after a moment. "Yes," she said. She was aware she should go. "You are not from this part of Yorkshire," he said. It was not quite a question. She had prepared for this. She had a story, and it was specific enough to be convincing and vague enough to be unverifiable. She had practiced it at the coaching inn, but standing here, now, with him looking at the south lawn with the same attention he seemed to give everything, she found that what came out of her mouth was a silence. And then, "I am not, my lord." She left the library before he could ask anything else. Mr. Ashby arrived in Millhaven on a Thursday, as arranged, and spent the day in conference with a contact whose name Leonora did not know. He sent her a note that came through the postal runner in the afternoon. It contained 2 pieces of information. The first was that the document she had identified would, if it could be properly examined, constitute significant evidence of Mortimer's mismanagement of the trust. Not merely the irregularities they had suspected, but a deliberate falsification of the original terms, which changed the nature of what Mortimer had done from questionable to actionable. The second was that the Earl of Ashvale had, 4 weeks ago, before Leonora had arrived, before any of this, sent a letter to a firm of solicitors in London, requesting an independent review of the Ashvale estate's acquisition documents. She read this second piece of information twice. She sat with it for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over. He had already suspected something. She was not certain, later, that she had made a rational decision. She thought it was more that the decision made itself, in the way that some decisions do when you have been holding them at arm's length for long enough. She knocked on the study door at 7:30 in the evening, when she knew from 3 weeks of observation that the Earl was there, and Mrs. Greer had retired, and Lady Strathmore had gone to bed early with a headache. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. He was at the desk, papers arranged in front of him with the precision of a man who thought in systems. He looked up. She stood in the doorway in her work dress, her hair plain, her hands, she noticed, not quite steady, and she said, "I should like to speak with you, my lord, about the estate, about my father's name on that box on the 3rd shelf, and about who I am." He was very still for a moment. Then he set down his pen. "Sit down, Miss Stowe," he said, and his voice was the same as it always was, careful, even, giving nothing away. But she thought that if she had been better at reading people, she might have found something there. She sat, and she told him. She had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Disbelief, perhaps, or the kind of careful, formal distance that men of his position used when faced with things that were inconvenient, or simple dismissal. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the full account, from her father's death to Mortimer's trusteeship, to the 4 months in York, to the coaching inn in Millhaven, to the servant's door. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he turned to the left-hand shelf and reached for the box with her father's name on it. He set it on the desk. He opened it. He read in silence, and she watched his face, which did the thing it always did. Moved very little, and then did something she had not seen it do before, which was go quite still in a specific way, the way a person's face goes still when they have confirmed something they did not want confirmed. "Your uncle?" he said. "Yes," she said. "He represented the estate to me as having been settled through the standard process. He was the trustee of record. He had documentation. He had documentation he had falsified," she said. "My father's original will stipulated that the estate was to pass to me directly on my 23rd birthday, with a period of trusteeship until that point. I am 24. I have been 24 for 6 months. He looked at her. "The house is yours," he said. "It has been mine since March," she said. "I simply haven't been able to prove it until now." He sat back. He looked at the papers and then at her, and she had the strange experience. Sitting in the study of her own house, in her work dress with her plain hair, after 3 weeks of wainscoting, and coal scuttles, and furniture moving, of having arrived somewhere, of being at last precisely where she had been trying to get. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me a great deal more than that," she said, and then caught herself. "I beg your pardon. That was accurate," he said. Something moved in his face that she thought might, with considerable goodwill, be called the beginning of something. It was accurate. The legal proceedings took 2 months. Mortimer, faced with the independent review the Earl had already set in motion, and the document Leonora had identified, declined to contest the matter in a way that saved everyone a great deal of unpleasantness, and himself a great deal of worse unpleasantness. Mr. Ashby, when it was finished, sent her a letter that was for him effusive, containing the phrase "a satisfactory resolution" twice. Lady Strathmore departed Ashvale Park on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Leonora told the Earl who she was, with the 2 carriages and the lady's maid and the considerable luggage. And she did not write, and the Dowager Countess's Tuesday letters, Leonora could only assume, shifted topic. Mrs. Greer, when she was told, looked at Leonora for a long moment with the pewter eyes and then said, "That explains the pear tree," and went back to her duties in a manner that suggested she considered the matter dealt with. The Earl stayed. This was not, Leonora thought, the outcome she had planned for. She had planned for the legal proceeding, and the resolution, and Mortimer's retreat, and the moment she could walk in through the front door of her house and have it be her house properly, in daylight, without a cloth and a tin of beeswax. She had planned for all of that. She had not planned for the Earl of Ashvale to ask, on a gray Wednesday afternoon in October, with the south lawn going gold and dull beyond the library window, whether she had any objection to his continued presence on the property during the transition period. He had phrased it formally. He was always formal, but he was looking at the south lawn the way he had looked at it that morning when she had been standing at the window. And she thought that formal was not quite the whole truth of what was being asked. "The transition period," she said. "There are matters still to be closed," he said. "It would be simpler if I were accessible. And after the matters are closed." He was quiet for a moment. The light came through the library window the way it always had, falling across the carpet in the long slants of October afternoon. "I should like to remain accessible," he said, "if you were willing to permit it." She looked at the south lawn and the wall and the light on it, the same light she had been looking at all her life, and thought that she had spent 3 weeks being smaller than she was, and she did not particularly wish to continue doing so. "Then stay," she said. The house was hers, the south lawn was hers, and the old pear tree at the corner of the north wall, and the yellow silk walls in the sitting room that her mother had chosen, and the fireplace that still drew slightly wrong and that she would have fixed in the spring. The portrait of her grandmother at the top of the east stair was hers. The library with the west window and the long October light was hers. And the man who had come into the library one morning and stood beside her and looked at the same view she was looking at, as though it were his, and then as though it were more than his, was, in the way that was still being settled, and in the way that mattered rather more, hers too.